Preparing to live stream the webinar. We're live, but we're not going to get started quite yet.
Stream directly out of Zoom now.
Live on YouTube.
Fancy. Future of technology.
Yeah, it's pretty sweet. Trying to make a LinkedIn post.
Yes, I see the live stream.
Well, we're waiting on a few other people and we'll get started in just a few minutes. My cat, can you hear my cat?
Yes, a little bit.
My cat says hello. Hello, hello. We'll wait about 2 more minutes and then kick it. I guess I can share my screen. Thanks for anyone that's hanging out on the YouTube channel. Share screen. All right. It's 1:02. We'll wait till 1:03 and get started. Got to make sure I hit the record button too. All right, you ready?
Yep.
Great. Cool. Let's get started. Hey, I'm Patrick Garrity, and today on this webinar we're hosting, we're going to talk about protecting against the rise in remote access attacks. And with us, I have Matt Warner, CTO of Blumira, who I'll introduce in a moment here. Feel free to ask any questions throughout the discussion that we have today. We're happy to interact with the audience, and we will have some time towards the end set for Q&A. So let's hop and get started. So Matt, it's great to have you to talk about some of these remote attacks and what your observations are.
Great to be here. Excited to talk about it.
So you've been working in security quite some time, and just share real quickly overview of what you're going to be talking about through the webinar today.
Sure, yeah. So today we are going to be looking at a box that we have facing the internet that allows people to authenticate over RDP. Essentially what that means is what kind of interaction the internet has with that machine, what kind of patterns we've seen change over the last 6 months since the start of coronavirus, and really what that means for your organization and how to best protect your organization as attacks increase over time and as the world changes, essentially.
Great. Yeah, and I think the first thing is just talking about what do we mean by remote access. Really what we're talking about is anything that's internet accessible from an access perspective. Typically, you'd find in your demilitarized zones, DMZ, sorry, really bad at complex words. So things like RDP, VNC, and MDM endpoint management, SSH, and others. And then, I find it kind of interesting. Why are we talking about remote access? Some of the things reading about, 91% of attacks targeted SMBs with ransomware, and specifically talking about RDP today. A lot of people are getting public access through RDP, which is not necessarily a best practice, and we'll talk about that. But RDP is the most common method or form of way to deploy ransomware or get access to deploy ransomware to these Windows systems, right?
Definitely. Yeah, it's a large issue right now, especially in the world of the need to manage machines remotely. It's easy to set up something that faces the internet with RDP, especially, and just point at the internet and connect into it. There's a large risk associated with the moment that someone else is able to authenticate into it, shared credential usage, so someone's able to essentially guess or reuse your credentials to get into that machine. You'll see throughout the discussion the sheer amount of attempts that get tried against these machines, and the risk of a publicly accessible RDP or really any sort of remote access significantly increases that risk of that environment, and it also exposes you to ransomware and other types of threats that you see inside of the ways that SMBs are being targeted with ransomware, especially.
Yep. So let's hop to your research and let's talk about what we found.
Sure. Yeah. So in this case, in our case, the honeypot essentially is a Windows server we have standing up inside of GCP. It's exposing HTTP, so IIS, you can see that in the bottom right there. IIS exposing as well as RDP. We were collecting the logs through one of our Boomi sensors. We're also collecting a large amount of logs from that Windows server. So not only just the Windows logs, but also IIS logs, firewall logs. And we do that because it's really the best way to get clear information into your environment. And it's really, as if you were using your Windows environment fully, it's ideal to collect logs from every layer of that machine, not just those Windows logs. You want to look at how you can expand those out into more verbose logs, which Boomi does help you with whenever we can, of course. So the big question really is how have things changed over the last 5 to 6 months? And what we've seen is really what we expected. There's been an 85% increase over the last 6 months. And really why that's been happening is something that we expect in the InfoSec world is as unrest increases around the world, as disruptions take attention away from due diligence inside of organizations, attacks will increase against all organizations across the board. So consider where your organization is, where any organization is right now. There was a big push to change everyone to remote work. There was a big push to get everyone up and going and then make sure you can manage your environment remotely. And with that comes not only just the need to access things remotely, but it also comes with the potential risk of misconfigurations, changes in environments, anything that could potentially expose environments. So that in nature drives additional scanning, it drives additional attacks. And in general, it increases stress in IT departments because of the stress that gets added to the security and the configurations, which leaves organizations open to attacks.
So I think it sounds interesting in times of uncertainty. Do you think also it could be associated with people having more free time on their hands?
It's probably partially that, and you have to think about how, in a large scale way, how criminal organizations work when it comes to attacking these environments. So you think about ransomware, you have to think about the organizations behind them, and there is something lucrative behind them. So as there's more free time for people, and there's more people spinning up organizations to do these kind of attacks, or they just in general have more time, then the attacks will increase because the potential return is significant. If you're able to land that attack successfully, then you're potentially able to also make money off that attack. So it's a cyclical environment that just kind of pushes itself over and over and over. And the more risk that gets introduced to the world, so something like coronavirus, introduces the ability for those organizations to grow and to also introduce additional scanning environments, additional ways to attack your environments and other environments on the internet, and to generally just be more successful.
So let's talk about the actual findings as far as where you've been seeing attacks come from.
Yeah, so these are, they got slightly out misaligned, but that's not a problem at all. So these are two examples of kind of over time, over the last 6 months, what we've seen in changes. And you'll see the numbers change on that the left and the right side, if it's streaming correctly, where it's really important for organizations to understand where these attacks are coming from. And by that, I mean, in kind of classic IT security mechanisms, we assume, hey, we know that these countries are threat countries. We know Russia is bad. You'll see Russia pop up there on the left. There's one right there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where your attacks are going to come from. And realistically, for a lot of our environments that we see, most attacks are going to be sourced from France, the Netherlands, as well as the United States. They're not going to be coming from China. They're not going to be coming from North Korea or Iran. Well, there might be there sometimes. Over time, what we're really seeing is a broad increase in volume across the entire outlier inside of the environment. There is no specific like, well, this country is an outlier now. It's more broad increase in scanning from everywhere in the world. And what that ends up resulting in is, it's a good example as to why playing whack-a-mole of like, well, we're going to block that country on our blacklist, and now we're going to block that country because we've seen an increase. It gets to really kind of impossible because you may have just seen like Finland pop up there in the top 5 for that week. It's in most cases, most organizations aren't like, well, you know, you really need to block Finland this week, and then next week we'll let them connect because they didn't get attacked by them. The world of being able to just say, well, we're going to block the threat countries is kind of gone at this point, largely because the expansive nature of hosting machines in the cloud has allowed these organizations to scan from anywhere because of the nature of other machines getting owned. So what tends to happen is if ransomware doesn't get dropped, either two other options happen. Either they're going to drop another RDP brute force software on that machine and then brute force additional RDP, which means it could be sourced out of the United States, it could be sourced out of the EU at that point, or they're going to actually just attack and get into your environment itself. So it kind of self-perpetuates where you see these situations where Russia might get into a box inside of France, but then they're going to pivot out and go from there. And in general, and internally, we generally expect as security professionals to see increased attacks from France and Netherlands because they host two large hosting providers, Linode and OVH, which are generally very accepting of essentially criminal organizations from within their environments. Hop to the next one.
Hey, I was muted when I was talking. We do have a question that came from anonymous attendee. It's a large that's a large increase. Where was the attacks changed in 2020 obtained from?
So there wasn't necessarily, if you want to go to the next slide, I can talk on this as well. There wasn't necessarily an increase from a specific location other than the Republic of Moldova. We did see a pretty sizable increase as you're seeing there from Moldova in 2020. And Moldova has very specific things that it scans for whatever reason. But generally speaking, what we saw really more than anything was just an increase in the amount of attempts and an increase in what they're scanning for and what they're trying to authenticate against. Russia, France, Netherlands, US are, I recommend anyone take a look at your logs, or we're happy to generate it for you, of course, if we're sending in logs over to Blumira. Almost all of your scanning infrastructure that's hitting your environment is going to be from those countries, just because of the nature of what's inside and what's hosted inside of them. And if you are already running a blacklist that's blacklisting something like Russia, then perfect. However, generally speaking, what we've seen over 2020 is just a general increase in these attacks from the environment as a whole. And if you look down in the right of here, you start seeing other countries like Canada, Belgium, Poland, Ireland, and you look at these, and a lot of people who are managing blacklists already know, like, well, I can't blacklist Canada, I can't blacklist Ireland because Microsoft is hosted out of Ireland in some cases. I can't blacklist Hong Kong necessarily because Microsoft has stuff hosted there as well. But you might want to blacklist China, you might want to blacklist Russia, and you get to a point where, as you can see, maybe you'll cut out a big chunk of these scans, but realistically, you will never be able to just stop them. So it's important to think about how can you reduce, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, how can you reduce that attack surface? Because it's a little easier to read here. You get that static kind of list and you get a nice tree map as to what's there. But it's, most of people don't know, like, is the Republic of Moldova on your blacklist? Is Argentina on your blacklist? It's really hard to know, but I can guarantee the United States and Canada aren't there, and you're still going to see a large amount of attacks out of the US and Canada just because of the nature of other machines getting owned and then them attacking you, or using cloud infrastructure to attack other environments inside of that country. So across this entire data set, and it's a little hard to tell because it's a tree map, there are over 124 countries involved in scanning and attacking over the last 6 months against this machine. So extrapolate that out to your blacklist. Most people are going to be blacklisting 10 to 25 countries that are attempting to connect into their environments. And no one really is blacklisting 120 plus countries for who can connect to these things, because at that point, it gets really hard to manage what you should be doing. And then you start looking at, well, maybe we should be whitelisting our traffic and saying, all right, we only are going to allow traffic from the US, Canada, Hong Kong, Ireland, that kind of thing. But you're still going to see attacks because of it. And it's really more ingrained into your environment at that point as to where you are, what you're exposing, how you're handling remote access, and less how can we stop these scanning attacks. Because realistically, when you're building your geo-blocking list and considering how you're handling geo-based security, just doing blacklisting makes it really difficult to keep up. And I'm a big fan of whitelisting countries, but of course, without organizational buy-in, it's really difficult. And without international, and if you're an international organization, it's really probably not realistic to say, all right, well, we're just going to whitelist everyone, or the ones that we need, because then you run into situations where there could be a business use case that you're unaware of, and it becomes a larger and larger issue and kind of snowballs.
What I've seen on the whitelisting side is, like, you know, it can be realistic for small businesses that maybe only operate in the States. State and local government, you know, can be a good, and federal government can be a good use case for that. But yeah, once you start operating internationally, right, it does become hard to maintain those policies and those lists effectively, and so it becomes a huge barrier for those companies.
Yeah, very much so. And if you ever just need to set up a blacklist, it's never going to hurt to have Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Unless you need to do business with those countries, it's rarely something that isn't worth doing in the environment.
Agree with you. So do you want to talk a little bit about the data and
Sure.
what you pulled, how you pulled it, and what information included in that?
Definitely. So this was about a gig of data. It was a gig of very refined data. So it was the time of the authentication, what the IP was, where that IP was, and the username they attempted to authenticate with. And it was about 10 million authentication attempts during that time period, which is a large amount of attempts over that time period. And these are all just people attempting to authenticate into this machine. And what's interesting about this data is how much it differs based on the source of the attack. So you'll see some familiar usage, like people trying to use administrator and admin to log in. But you start to get to interesting kind of outliers associated with all of them, and to how it actually fits together. Because in general, we saw over 170,000 unique usernames attempted during this time period. So it's not, well, from this list, you can see things like administrator, admin, user, support, and then a few other things that I'll touch on here in a second. Realistically, there's a very large swath of usernames and passwords that are being attempted against this, because you have to consider things like password breaches that are out there, leaked credential lists. All these get reused against your machines with the hope that they will be able to land a successful authentication against it. Because think about a situation where maybe you had a LinkedIn account back during the LinkedIn breach and you had a username, and that password was reused with a machine that also was based on Windows Off that's now facing the internet. That's a good, successful win for that scanner. So it's all that information gets reused. It all gets recycled across all of these organizations. And really, it's because people will scan and they're going to use that environment from that scan to attempt to attack your environment. So it's not just going to be organizations that are just like, we're going to try administrator password everywhere on the internet. It's really going to be really targeted attacks against your environment. And you can see like this XYZ over here on the right there. That's there because this machine was called log test XYZ. And what they did, especially this one IP out of Russia, 45.141.87.17, which is a block that we see a large amount of scans out of Russia. And what they did was they initially scanned the machine, they gathered as much host information as they could, and then they attempted to authenticate using information based off the name, the domain, based off the general FQDN, so the fully qualified domain name of this thing. And they attempted to authenticate tens to hundreds of thousands of times against this machine using the information they gathered off of it. So it's not just going to be casual attempts against those environments. It's going to be targeted attacks, and they're targeted in ways that are automated. So it's not some situation where someone's going to sit down and try to get your environment. You have to think about the infrastructure that's built around these attacks and the amount of potential outcome for these organizations that they're able to successfully get into your environment. There's a robust environment around all of this. And continuing off that, I think you want to go to the next one. Having something unique doesn't keep you secure necessarily. So if we start looking at the smaller data sets, you start to see some interesting targeted attacks. You can go to the next one as well. This is just a good example of how different countries use different names. So and by that I mean, if France is attacking, you'll see like administrator with a D coming from Spain, administrator in English-speaking countries. So you start to see differentiation between where these attacks are coming from. And I like this word map because it shows you the sheer amount of differentiation between the type of users that people are attempting to authenticate in with. And you'll start to see situations where you'll see unique usernames used, things like West Contracting is one that got used heavily, which is just kind of a contracting company they pulled out and they probably had credentials for, so they attempted to scan with it. Then you see things like Blumira Internal is in there, Blumira Internal Admin, because that was the name of the machine. And then you can start to see more broad ones, like actual names getting rolled into here, usernames getting rolled into here, and then different variations of things that they know are going to be vulnerable, have default credentials like Canon, that kind of thing.
I think, hey, on this note, right, I think this kind of emphasizes as well the importance of changing defaults, like default passwords, implementing two-factor, right? You know, that's one of the things. It's like, yeah, you know, so many of these are just default, you know, backup admin, administrator, admin, username, all that sort of stuff is just one observation, right? And likely a lot of them are just testing based on that. So
and here's a good example of countries and names used with casing also considered here. So, I mean, there's a sizable amount of attempts just coming from Russia using administrator. And consider the sheer amount of different different passwords you can try with administrator. So, as Patrick is saying, changing your defaults is incredibly important to make sure that they are not still there. And really, security through obscurity is to an extent slightly meaningless, but it does help, and it never hurts to Make sure you're not using usernames that are easy to predict for a number of other reasons. If anything else, it means that people have to do additional work to figure out how to attack you, which is, it's always a beneficial thing when attackers are being considered.
Does capitalizing your letters increase your odds of success?
And Windows, casing usernames doesn't count. So sadly,
I know.
in Linux, yes, it does, but not in Windows. And then in this next slide is also a good example, and you see this on that fifth row there. These are the really low. These are like one-time use across the entire environment. These are where interesting outliers come in. And this is where you can see a situation where the scanner messed up when they were setting up their environment, and they forgot to split their attempt of help and then the password that was being run against it. So these are the kind of things that these people are running against your environments, where they're saying, all right, I know I have this list of credentials, I have this list of username, I'm gonna run this against every single machine I can find on the internet, I'm gonna try to authenticate against it. And that's not a bad password. I mean, it's a word password, which is bad, but it's not a terrible password, all things considered. So consider the sheer size of the list that these people are basing their attacks off of, are basing their scans off of. And these are the kind of things, thankfully these people messed up, so it's always beneficial to us. But it's a good piece of information to show kind of the sheer amount of information. And in this case, these are all single attempted usernames against the machine that we had in the cloud. And there were hundreds of thousands of 100,000 plus, I should say, single attempt usernames. And then you get into the bigger ones that you saw on the top left side of that tree map, where it's like admin, that kind of thing. But realistically, a lot of them are that, like, we have a valid leaked list. We know that these are working names and passwords. We're going to run this against everything until we find something that works. And it's successful. It works a lot of the time. So it's important to think about how you're exposing your remote access. Alrighty. So why is this happening? Let me move my slides forward in a second. So it's the inevitable, and I touched on this previously, and it's one of those situations where it's just kind of inevitable during a turmoil within the world, especially when remote work is forced, that there will be security risks. For example, over the first 5-6 months this year, Zscaler identified a 30,000% increase in phishing since COVID started. And you want to click next. There's a little example right there. There's a good example. And here's an example of a phishing email that had been sent out recently associated with FMLA and COVID within your environment. And these kind of phishing emails get pretty good success in organizations because people are worried, they aren't sure what's going on. And you talk about an organization that's now been forklifted into fully remote, those staff also are just increasing in worry, and they're not really sure necessarily what is or isn't real. So that increase in phishing will continue, that increase in scanning will continue, because they know that people are thrown off what they're used to doing. And that also leads to shadow IT, which is talked about on and off in the environment. And it probably could stand to be talked about more. You'll probably hear it talked about more over the next few years. But essentially what shadow IT is a situation where what IT needs doesn't align with what the business needs are giving it. And then IT essentially will just make changes or do things to get the work done, which is expected. It's one of those things that CISOs and CIOs and people at the director level should expect to happen in situations where your IT staff asks for something like secure password storage or things like that. That's when IT will make a choice of, like, you know what, we're just going to save this stuff in Evernote and we're going to share it with each other. We're going to save this stuff in G Suite. We're going to send it to each other in Teams. And then you have to think about, well, what happens next? What happens if someone gets into that environment and they just search our Teams for password and they're able to get all the passwords associated with the environment because we didn't handle the business need associated with IT? And in situations like right now, shadow IT is kind of an inevitable need. You know, think of it like tech debt or IT debt for your environment. Because things are moving fast, it's hard to make decisions on what those needs are. So things will fill in behind it. So it's important as you look back on this year to look at the kind of things that got changed to make sure that remote work could happen, to make sure that everyone is getting what they need, and look back and say, all right, we're going to introspect and look to see how we built these things and make sure there's not anything that we missed in regard to that had to get built in as essentially shadow IP. And sorry, yeah, we can go. You're good. The only thing I other wanted to mention on that was that these kind of things will continue to happen. There will be another 0 day that happens, like the Citrix 0 day that happened in January. These groups move fast, and they will add those attacks quickly. So it's important, as we go through these 4 things, it's important to think about kind of how you're protecting yourself, how your organization can be safe, and kind of how you're moving forward. Because protecting yourself and your organization is incredibly important right now. And these are a few quick wins that will help you get moving in the right direction. And if you aren't aware as to what's there, you'll never be able to secure it. Is realistically what it comes down to. So the number one thing you always want to make sure you're doing is you're only exposing what you need to the internet. So you want to make sure what your business needs are. So you're hosting a website in your DMZ. That's great. That's cool. That's a needed business need. That we completely get that. You need a VPN there. Perfect. That makes sense. But what you don't necessarily need is to host the management side of your Tomcat server to the internet. You don't necessarily need to expose the MDM solution to the internet, or you don't really need to expose the management side of your FortiGate to the internet. But these are all things that we see fairly often. And because it's easy to make that mistake, it's easy to accidentally attach the management interface to your FortiGate to the external interface just because you're busy and you didn't see where you made that change. So it's important to kind of audit what you're doing, audit what you're seeing, look at what you have facing the internet, and that's where we come up to number 2. It's important to either scan your internet-facing assets or look at using Shodan or Census what is actually being exposed in your environment. So, are you exposing things that are unexpected? Do you have additional IP space you're unaware of with your certs inside of them? And Census can be useful for that kind of thing. It's really important to reduce that attack surface down to your necessarily needed exposed assets and everything else you place behind that VPN. So you have that single point of authentication to get in. So it's totally fine to VPN into an environment and then RDP into what you need RDP into. But when you just expose RDP and you have a VPN, now you have multiple points of potential threats to your environment. And by reducing that attack surface down to just that VPN, it makes logging easier and it makes protecting it much easier as well. And that leads us to 2FA, which is always very important in the environment. There should be no way to authenticate into your environment from the internet that doesn't have 2FA. And it's also really important to collect those 2FA logs. There are some mitigating things you could do. You could do full whitelists, so only people that can connect to the VPN are on IPs that you're aware of, that kind of thing. But 2FA will make life a million times easier for you and for your organization in regard to securing your environments and making sure the people you expect to be there are there. And worst case, if you do have a large credential breach and you then are able to at least detect that someone is attempting to authenticate against a large number of your users and then failing that next 2FA step, so you can take action previous to there being a legitimate full breach of your environment. And of course, leveraging your logs and your infrastructure to give you visibility into not only attacks, but also potential issues that are introduced over time is very important, because especially right now, it's really easy for an organization to accidentally expose ACLs in ways that they didn't mean to or intend to when making changes to the firewall, especially when things need to be more remote, especially when you're trying to just kind of move fast and get exposure there. It's really easy to accidentally just kind of open up RDP in a block that you didn't necessarily intend to. And then all of a sudden scanners are going to start hitting that and start getting allows that you're on your actual firewall. And maybe there's not something at the back end. Maybe there's nothing there right now because the NAT's translating to an IP that's not currently live. But what happens in a month if that does come up? RDP is up on that Windows server and they're able to authenticate in. And perhaps you left defaults on because you didn't realize it was exposed to the internet. So it's important to make sure that you're reviewing those logs, that you're reviewing what's facing the internet. And because a scan wouldn't necessarily tell you if something on your ACLs is allowing it, looking at those logs will and making sure that you're getting what you need to see, all right, here are the risks in my environment and here's what I can glean out of those logs is also super important.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting, right? Like these are fundamental things. But I think my biggest observation is time and time again, most organizations are, and especially when we're talking about smaller mid-sized business, right? They're not doing or implementing all these controls. They're not double checking. They're not they don't have the proper logging in place. And so, yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to like time, visibility, and execution, right?
Definitely.
So you have to have tools in place that are going to allow this to be, easy and effective to do. And so transition a little bit, let's talk about Blumira and what we do to help with these different things. Do you want to talk through a little bit on, you
Sure,
built and
yeah.
architected this platform. How do we help customers in that
Yeah,
regard?
definitely. Yeah. So here at Blumira, we take a slightly different approach in regard to how we handle detection, as well as how we consider certain things to be issues for an environment. So Blumira approaches RDP and other protocols such as like SMB, FTP, SSH, any kind of remote access as potential risks or threats associated with when they're connected to by a public IP. So there are definitely situations for all organizations where FTP is connected to from public IP. That's understandable. It's an accepted risk. It's a plain text protocol, so we're going to bug you about it, kind of thing. But then you get into situations where RDP or SMB are exposed to the internet. We're seeing public access. Those are very risky situations that are rarely acceptable, and that they kind of just increase risks in the environment. So the way that Blumira approaches these situations are that we want to identify risks, we want to identify potential suspects, so situations that could become threats, and we want to identify threats to the environment, proper threats to the environment themselves. So someone attempting to RDP to your environment from a public IP is a pretty low priority threat. It's still a threat, but the moment that someone authenticates into that device, it doesn't. It's all over at that point. So it's a situation where we want to make sure that organizations are aware as to the potential risk in the environment, as well as the potential risks of those environments. So as we kind of combine together the tendency with during complicated times such as now, it's easy for IT workers to either overly expose an ACL, as we already talked about, or to just need a way to get into something. So we kind of supplement that by making sure that we have detections like the one you see here, RDP connection from a public IP, to ensure that organizations have good visibility into their environment. It's not possible to be perfect 100% of the time. Change requests will fail. Peer review will fail at times. So by doing this and by having detections like RDP connection from a public IP, SMB from public IP, potential risk connections like management interface exposed to the internet on the firewall, it allows organizations to be much more careful about how they're approaching things. And by that, I mean, they don't need to guess as to what they're doing. They can move forward. They can get their changes in. If something goes wrong, Blumira supports them in getting any of those issues fixed, as well as getting information associated with them. And then, of course, we also leverage that into our dynamic block list feature, which you'll see here in the demo as well, that allows people to not only detect when a potential risk like a public IP is connecting over RDP, it allows you to block that IP via the workflow or through automated blocking. And then it allows you to work on resolving the issue that's actually found associated with why is that open on the ACL? Is there something behind there that's actually being attacked? If something was attacked, did they successfully authenticate? And so it allows that nice layering of security, which we always love defense in depth, of course, inside of the security world. So it allows you to get a good view as to where you are, good visibility, and active defense against your environment as well.
Cool. I'm going to show a quick demo. Try and do it in about 5 minutes or less of Blumira, right? And some of the things you're talking about. So specifically here, just to take a quick look from an infrastructure perspective, we have a sensor. And the joy of this is the sensor also acts as a honeypot. So you can essentially add different modules and integrate with your existing technology stack. So for instance, Duo, you could put your API keys in, really anything, technology product you want to integrate with, and the honeypot module, as I mentioned, hit install, and now I'm detecting lateral movement. Now, once we're actually starting to detect threats, we have a responder view, and I have some examples in here in which I can show where we're doing detections like anomalous access attempts, unlikely location, and or remote access, right, for an example. And I'm going to pop up a Citrix gateway exploit attempt. In this case, right, like the attacker is actually trying to exploit the fact that the Citrix gateway is out of date. And there's a vulnerability, and so I can grab this ticket here. And the great thing is Blumira provides the walkthrough as far as what's going on, the source matched evidence, and you can see here this is stacked, and what we're detecting from an analysis perspective. And then we're able to immediately apply rules to the firewall's block list to stop this attack. And even taking it a step further, right, we can automate that. So if I check this box, it would automatically take that action when things like this are detected, without any human interaction, right? And I think what's extremely valuable is most organizations, like, they just that's a known threat. They just want to eliminate and take care of that problem immediately. Some of the other examples, just to show real quick, that we're talking about here in useful. You talked quite a bit about the risk and threats of RDP, for instance. And so, just identifying the risk that someone has a connection via RDP on the internal network from a public IP address is a great example of a real risk and threat. In having that information to be able to make that decision of, yeah, this shouldn't be happening, and we need to go and make a configuration change so this isn't. And making sure someone connects up via VPN or a proxy. So yeah, really the whole premise here is to surface the things that matter, so that you as an organization can take action to reduce your threat surface, and make sure that you're able to identify real risks and threats within your environment. So Matt, anything else you want to comment on the product side as far as addressing the needs we're talking about today for our customers?
Yeah, I mean, so Blumira is built to ensure that we tell you when there are potential risks to your environment, and that we tell you when there are legitimate threats that need to be acted on within your environment as well. And situations like RDP being exposed to the internet, and really remote access as a whole being exposed to the internet, is one of those situations where it can very easily get pushed to the side, because if it's not set up in a way that's robust and correct, it's going to be either really noisy or you'll get nothing out of it. So what we've done instead is built our detections in a way, especially for situations like RDP and stuff being derived from the public internet and how it's interacting with your environment, to ensure that it's valid. And by that I mean that when it's happening, you know that either there's an ACL issue or that something is actually connecting. And to ensure that you're securing your environment, and Blumira is working with you to ensure that your environment is growing, getting more secure, and not just saying like, oh, here's an alert, good luck figuring this out. We want to make sure that you're growing and your environment is growing and getting more secure with our notifications and our findings as well.
Great. So we had a few questions. I see an additional question or two, just about prioritizing, hey, with having limited resources, right? What are you talked about some of the different effective controls. What would you essentially say is the best bang for your buck, or place that you should start?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, the best place to start is to get visibility into what's currently happening in your environment. That can be through scanning and through log collection, because without knowing what's happening in your environment, without knowing how traffic is flowing, without knowing what exists, it's not actually possible to ensure that you're secure. So that's where I'd start is figuring out what you have, and figuring out how traffic is flowing through it and how you're currently handling controls within that environment. Because without having insight into that side, it gets really hard to kind of just chase holes. You want to start to build a map as to where you are, and then fix those holes and figure out where you are. Security is an ongoing process. It always will be. So making sure that you're kind of just starting that process and that working that process is where you want to be. You can't start at the end. It's just not possible. So you want to start at the beginning, get visibility, figure out where you are, figure out where you want to get to. And then we, at products like Blumira, will help you get there as well. But definitely it's a lot of getting visibility, figuring out where you are, making sure you have good knowledge as to what your environment is, because without that, it's not really possible to ensure that you're secure.
Yep. One other question was about, what threats do you perceive as over the next 6 to 9 months are going to be happening?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So over the next 6 to 9 months, I'm going to generally expect that we'll see a continued increase in the scanning activity for a number of reasons. However, as we generally get into continued unrest across the entire world at this point, will largely result in more targeted nation state kind of type attacks, which don't usually impact environments other than situations where they leverage services. So a good example might be a few years ago when GitHub was taken down with a DDoS attack because they were hosting material that wasn't liked by the Chinese government. If you use GitHub internally or you use it for your development practices, in that situation, you would be completely down at that point. So there, in situations like that, I expect to see increases of like large scale kind of disruptions across environments. However, in regard to actual organizations, expect to continue to see increased attacks across phishing. Expect to see, especially in regard to like domain permutations. So you want to make sure when you're training your users in regard to phishing, that they're aware as to how to check where that information is coming from, that they're checking to see that it's coming from something that is a legitimate source. And if they're not sure, you want to make sure that that process is, all right, ask IT security, have a process in place and not just, well, you figure it out and then come back to us if you get owned. You want to make sure that there's a process in place to handle that. And the more that you test, so if you do it quarterly, annually, it's been proven time and time again, the more you do phishing tests, and I know this is slightly not fun time to do phishing tests, but the more you can do phishing tests, the more that you can do training that engages people. The open rates will go down on those phishing emails, the less you'll have to worry about the risk associated with those attacks, because those attacks are going to increase, they'll all increase. And as you start to see situations like global recessions or global depressions, it is inevitable that you will see increases in cybercrime because it's an easy and fast way to make money at scale remotely. You have to consider kind of cybercrime work from home situation. Can I work from home and make a bunch of money doing this in a situation where I can make no other money? It's a perfect situation for that. So you want to make sure that you're being kind of following what you would generally try to do. So making sure that your organization is at least moving in the direction of being trained in regard to doing phishing exercises. They understand kind of the impact of the environment. They understand the impact of macros. They've seen what a weaponized Word document looks like. So for those of you who've seen it, you open it up and it has that fun screen of like, this is a protected Word document. If you open macros, it'll be perfect. Everything will be great. Almost no one gets a legitimate email that looks like that, has opened a Word document looks like that. But unless you've shown your staff that kind of example and they know, like, if I open this and it looks weird, and then I get to this point where I've actually opened the whole file and it looks real weird and it looks like something I've seen before, they know, bail out, talk to IT, move forward. Because we want to make sure that as people, especially stay remote workers, that they have a path to get to report those issues. So really expect a continued increase in that phishing and scanning. There will, of course, be 0 days that come out over this next year because it's an inevitable thing, kind of like the Citrix ones we saw early this year. The Citrix, as a good kind of timing example for everyone, the Citrix 0 day that came out that allowed essentially someone remote access to your Cisco gateway, it took about 3 days for it to go from a proof of concept on GitHub to being part of the scanning infrastructure that was attacking the environment. So you get about 48 to 72 hours to make sure that you're where you want to be when situations like that happen. So it's good. It's a good time right now to kind of sit down with your IT and security team, the whole stack, and say, if we get a notification or if we see a situation like this that we need to move fast, can we move quickly? Here's how we can do it. And kind of have a call tree in place and a process in place to make sure that it's not a legitimate incident response, but it's still a situation where you want to move quickly and secure your environment from potential risk as well. So it's a culmination of kind of things, but expect to kind of see general increases. I don't expect that we'll see a new novel attack over the time period here, but you will see continued increase, especially in the world of ransomware and the related money-making attacks associated with cybersecurity.
That's a lot of great advice, Matt. We're at the top of the hour, so we're gonna wrap up. One thing I would add comment wise is I kind of laugh, but at this one, but I think next year in the DBIR report for 2020, when it comes out in 2021, the Verizon Data Breach Report, if no one's familiar with that, my joke is that there's actually going to be a new threat vector, and it's called Little Susie. And it's the little kids accessing their, I have kids myself, 6 and 9. It's a little children logging into their parents' laptops and devices. And I think that's a reality, which is like, some of the basic fundamentals when you're in a work from home situation change. So we'll see. It's going to be a lot of interesting things to see on the security front over the next year. And yeah, just want to say I appreciate you taking the time to talk about the remote attacks and the data in which you've seen. And look forward to hearing more on this, Matt. Thanks so much.
No, thank you.